Hi, this is the development log for MicroSplat, talking about the 1.21 version. So I've actually done a lot of work on MicroSplat since it was released and haven't put out videos on each release the way I have with Megasplat. So I wanted to basically play catch up and talk about all the things that have been going on with this tool. Sorry if there's a bit of fan noise on this. I'm uploading the latest version of Megasplat in the background, and this little laptop. It doesn't like you doing too much stuff at once, but hopefully it's okay. I have Megasplat here on my little testing scene, or sorry, MicroSplat, and I've added a bunch of new controls, some new features, and so I'm just going to try and go through all of those and talk about them. Since the 1.0 release, I added an option called Max Texture Count, and by default this is set to 16. You can lower it down to as little as 4. This provides a very small optimization. It's really not that big of a deal. The main reason you use it is that on Macs, the Apple drivers that Apple ships for the Macs limit you to 16 texture samplers, even though the hardware can support 32. So you run out of texture samplers on the Mac, and this actually lets you reclaim 3 of them. Now on PC, you're really never going to run into this limit. One, because it's a 32 texture sample limit, and 2, because I actually, in the shader, I share samplers where I can. And on Windows machines and high-end consoles, it can share most of the samplers, so you never really run into this. But it does provide a very small optimization to set it down to the number of textures that you're using on your terrain. I expose a lighting model property. By default, this is set to automatic, and this means it's going to do what Unity does naturally, which is that it uses GGX specular for your lighting model on most machines, and then when you get onto some of the lower end platforms like mobile and things like that, it will reduce down to a different specular model, which is a bit cheaper. But what you can actually do is you can actually force these. Standard shader is the GGX standard shader model. Simplified is a simplified model. I believe it's based off GGX but with a simpler term. I'm not exactly sure on that. These are available sort of in Unity shaders. And then finally you can force it down to blend fong. And the reason I do this, expose this, is one of the users doesn't like the way that the specular response happens on GGX. And so this allows them to force it down. It also means that you can, if you're working on a low-end mobile device and you really do want a certain specular model, you can override it and not have it automatically degrade on the devices. I had an option to disable height-based blending, so I was doing some profiling with a user on low-end Android, and he actually found that disabling the height blending math actually did provide a bit of a speed up. So this is basically, if you disable that, it's the same as if you took your interpolation contrast slider here and you put it all the way down, all the way up to 1, where the lowest, or sorry, the leftmost setting here, where it's the blurriest. It gives you the same result as that, essentially. And it just removes all the math that it would be doing for no reason if you're going to set it all the way down. Let's find the next thing that's new. The Geo texture has a new feature which is kind of neat. Let me turn this on. That's going to recompile the shader. So here we have our geo height texture over our terrain. And there are 2 new features, it's Geo Range and Geo Curve. Geo Range lets you basically ramp in and out this texture based on a range so that it only affects, say, the top of the terrain or something like that. And so that can be useful just to limit. You can do that within the texture, but you might want to tile that texture. And then when you enable that feature, you have a actual geo range which says, hey, this is going to start at 150 meters. It's going to be fully opaque at 200 meters. It's going to last for 200 meters, and then it'll be a fading over 350 meters. Yeah, you can set up that range and essentially, cause it to, you notice it's not as much here, sort of change the opacity of that effect. And let me go ahead. I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to turn on the Geo Curve. So this is a feature one of my beta testers asked for, and I finally got around to putting in. It's kind of a neat feature. I think for sort of fantastical terrains, it could be really neat. And I'm interested to see how people might use this. It's pretty cheap, so that's nice. So with Geo Curve enabled, you actually get a height curve here. And you can come in here, and you can set up any kind of curve you want. Let me just frame this curve. And we can see that as I change this curve, it pushes around these lines so that we are perturbing where this texture's line is, right? Like where its height value is. And so you can create sort of Dr. Seussian, wavy geo lines that way, which is pretty cool because it's a nice control to be able to use a curve for that. And then you can also offset and rotate that curve, which can create some pretty wild effects, along with that offset, which lets you move it around in world space. So let's turn that off. Go ahead and turn off the geotexture feature. And let's go to the global tint for a second. So global tint used to just be multiply 2x and overlay. There's a few things that have been added to this. First of all, if you are in multiply 2x mode, or in overlay mode, either one of them. It doesn't have a texture now, so it's just brightening this whole thing. We could, I don't know, grab something silly to stick on here, like this bush texture. Let's do something we can actually see. This icon, maybe. Okay. I'll stick an icon over the whole terrain. So you have your normal sort of strength, but now what you can actually do is say that your global texture has a begin, fade, and then the opacity in which that happens, and then a fade range and an end opacity. So by default, these are both 1. The beginning, if we put these both at 0, it's going to basically be on all the time, and it'll exist everywhere. But if we actually turn up that begin fade, let's put that at like 100. Let's put it at 100. We turn the opacity down so that at 100 meters, we are going to be have no effect there. And then the fade range, we can say is it's going to fade out over 100 meters or fade in this case. And you can see now we've created a fade in of this thing. And we can, or really we're fading it out close to the camera. But we can set these up to have basically a fade out range. You could, have it just in the mid or just at the end or just at the beginning. So you can create different types of effects with this. And because you can set the opacity amount, you can use this to basically act as like, hey, you know what? I want like 20% of this mixed in when you're close and 80% of it mixed in the back. So I could, for instance, set this to 80% at the back and say I just want 20% opacity up close, and it will blend accordingly. So if we go back, there's also now a crossfade mode. And these blending ranges, they work for all the modes. And they're nice for all the modes, but this is the mode it was really sort of meant for. And the idea here is that you are crossfading between your splat mapping and the texture you're providing for the tint in this case. And so if you have satellite imagery, what you could do is put the satellite imagery here, and you could crossfade your albedo to the satellite imagery. And again, you could use those opacity amounts to control how much of it is at the near and how much of it is at the far in terms of the blending in. And these same settings are available for the normal. So if you have like a global normal for your whole terrain, some satellite imagery, you can crossfade to that, and it will all just work. And if you have alpha channels in your your images, it will obey those alpha channels, so that you can actually like have a mask and you could paint, where it comes in and how much. And that's actually true of the geo texture as well. Snow, let's see, there's a few fixes, but nothing. Oh, there's a new one for wetness called Wetness Height. And what this is for is shorelines, really. If you have a game and you have water at a certain height, let's say the water is at 100 meters or 0 or whatever, you can actually say, hey, you know what, everything below this certain height, so over here we see it, everything below this height, make it wet. And then you can actually set up a little animation here so that the shoreline comes in and recedes, which you can synchronize with your waves. So, let's find that setting. Modeling streams. Where are we here? Here we go. So we have a wetness range here, which is basically like the allowed wetness that we're allowed to have on a terrain. If you take the top of this down, it's going to reduce the overall wetness on the terrain. So that's for pre-painted wetness. And then here we have the height value, the contrast value for that transition here, and then the frequency that it's moving up and down, and the amplitude. So if you set the amplitude to 0, it's going to be still. If you set the frequency to 2, it's going to happen quicker. And if your wave system is based on sine functions for the shore lap, which it usually is, you should be able to get these things matched up. And then the contrast, of course, is how quick that line is, right? Like if you turn it way up, it's going to be softer or harder accordingly. So that's that. Go ahead and turn that off. And I'm going to switch over to, let's skip over the terrain blending stuff. There's some new stuff there. We'll talk about triplanar UVs, because that's actually got a bunch of new stuff in it, which is cool. So now the standard technique for triplanar UVs is that you sample every texture from 3 projections, top, side, and front, and then you blend them together. By default, that uses a linear blend, and sometimes it's hard to find a good spot to really show this off, but you'll see places like this, right, where these textures sort of smear together. And what you normally do is play with this triplanar contrast, and you turn this up, and what this does is say, so you can see here as I turn this up that blend gets a little better. What this really does is bias it so that you stay on one texture for a longer period of time. So you tend to be just the front, and then when you get really close to the other projection is when you suddenly switch over, right? So that helps, but it doesn't really solve the issue as much as this new technique. So I have a thing called triplanar height blend. And what this does is it does the same type of height blending we do for regular terrain textures to cross each other, right? We normally look at the height data and decide which one wins based on height, and we have a very small blending area. So we can do the same thing with the triplanar data itself. And so now I can turn this blend contrast way down to let these textures really overlap, okay? And if my interpolation contrast is quite high, you'll see that these textures here, they're all being height blended from these different projections, so we don't get the sort of, what would you call that? The sort of, 2 rocks or 2 pieces of the texture kind of like just kind of smearing over each other thing anymore. It actually is one of those 2 rocks is going to win and sort of pop out from the other one. I'll turn tessellation on to make this a little more apparent too. So the cost of that, I debated whether I should just make that always on, because it is not that expensive to do, but I figured I would leave it backwards compatible with the old one and make it an option, so that people could choose. It also changes around the parameterization a little bit, what you want. You tend to want a higher interpolation contrast than this blurrier one. and you tend to want to actually turn down the triplanar contrast, which is that normal base contrast based on the sides, right? You want to turn that down and let the textures blend over each other because the height resolve is actually going to resolve those. But you still can use that to sort of favor those edges a little bit more if you want to push them a little more. And so with this change, triplanar UV scale is now its own setting. It used to use the global UV settings that everything would have right here. But now it has its own UV settings. And one of the big reasons for that is if you go into the per texture properties here, there's two new options. One is that you can actually disable triplanar on individual textures. So if we turn that on, and we compile the shader, again, I'm doing lots of things in the background, so my little laptop is yelling at me right now. Then this 0 to 1 value on any texture here, let's select this texture that we're looking at, we can actually switch between the regular UVs and the triplanar UVs on that, just by sliding that. And it will then use the UVs from the global UVs up here. So if I set this to 1, you can see that the global UVs here, which the grass seems to be on right now, are scaling, but the triplanar are not, because we're using the triplanar. If we switch that to disable the triplanar, then you will see that these UVs are used instead of the other ones. So that sort of gives you the ability to, you may have a texture which is great for ground, but the triplanar doesn't look so great on it. So you could disable that. Examples of that might be paths or things like that. Now, why you have them on the hill where they're triplanaring, I'm not sure, but sometimes you run across textures that they look better stretchy than they do being triplanar. So now you have the ability to turn that on and off. And then you can also control that contrast adjustment for the triplanar height blend on a per texture basis as well. So that gives you a bunch of new controls there to sort of tweak out the triplanar. So let's talk about the terrain blending module, because there were some new features added to that. I already have that on, so I'm going to go find an object to play with. Let's grab this one for now. Actually, that one. All right. So here we have our rock object, which has the terrain blending up on it. We have a new feature called slope. And what that does is let you filter, and I'm going to move this guy over here so it blends with this grass. Like that. So it lets you filter where this happens based on the angles of the normals of the object. So here we have a rock where I've sort of jettisoned it out of the side here. It's blending with the ground, which is great. But we have the slope filter here, which if we turn that all the way down, what it does is it starts putting the terrain on the top of the object, right? So now I can have an object that sits like this, where the bottom is intersecting, but I'm able to put some of the terrain's texturing up on the top there, which can look really nice for grasses and stuff, because you get these like little bits of moss appearing on top, which is very contextual. So even though this rock has no moss in it, in terms of its texturing, we can bring some in from our terrain there, and it'll really start to just kind of look like it's grown into that terrain a little bit. So that's a super cool feature, very cheap. A user suggested it on the forums, and I thought that was a good idea, so I coded it up. Now, let me go into my notes and see what else we have here. So I did remove any ads from the carousel once you buy the modules to hopefully so you see just the ones you don't have, And if you have been so kind as to buy them all, then you don't have any more ads, which is nice. Fixing a bunch of issues, just little things. You know, the rollout went really well. There weren't really a whole lot of issues, which I'm really psyched about. You write a lot of code. You hope you get it all right, and sometimes you get it mostly right. So that's pretty cool. So let's talk about Vegetation Studio integration really quick, and some of the baking stuff that is available now. So if you haven't heard of Vegetation Studio, it's a great program. It's going to be released fairly soon. It basically replaces all of Unity's terrain vegetation systems, and it does it all on the GPU, or rather most of it on the GPU, so it's very fast and lets you have lots more vegetation than you would normally have. So I talked to the guy who writes that quite a bit. He's been working very hard on that system, and he is using MicroSplat a lot to test. And so we came up with a few new features. So the first one is that, and this is a common trick that a lot of shaders do, a lot of grass shaders will take an image of the terrain. They will take like an albedo image of the terrain and use that to tint the bottom of the grass. And so he's like, hey, can you bake that out? And I've already done this for MegaSplat, so I was like, yeah, no problem. So now you can go over here, you can select whichever channels you want. In this case, I'm just going to bake out the albedo, and then you can just hit export and give it a second. And there you go. It'll render out the albedo of the terrain to its own texture, and it'll stick that in your MicroSplat data directory. And then Unity will import this, which will take a little time. And you can do this for normals or anything you need. And again, it's baking out the splat data, which is in this case, you know, where the grass and the rocks and all that stuff is. But when you're baking out something like normal, it's not baking out a normal map for the global terrain. It's baking out a normal of the little splat data, which you know, if you bake it out at 1024 or something like that, is going to be fairly low res. Why is this taking so long to import? Oh, it's because I'm running all that stuff in the background still. Let's see here. I'm sure it's written out the texture, so I'll just go in there and grab that really quick. MicroSplat. Let's go into, I'm in my demo scene. And here is our albedo texture. So you can see that it's taken all the albedo component of grass and stones and things like that and rendered this out to a final texture here. And then you can use that as your tint map in your grass. So I don't know why Unity is taking so long to import this. I have a feeling it is not happy for some reason. And it may be because of all the stuff in the background, or it's just taking a while. So the other feature that we did is a pretty cool feature. I won't show it here. Vegetation Studio will probably be doing some demos and videos and stuff on this. But one of the problems that you have with grass and vegetation is that at some point it becomes too expensive to draw it all the way into the distance, right? So you end up drawing your vegetation here, and then somewhere around here you just can't afford to do it anymore, and it just goes away, right? And so if we put grass all over this brown terrain here, then that would look pretty jarring because all of a sudden it would just disappear and it'd be like this clear line as you move around where the grass disappears. So what most people do is they put grass under a green surface and they try to get the colors to match up as well as possible, and you just kind of slowly fade out the grass or do the best you can and hope for the best. There we go, finished importing. So what we now have is an integration with Vegetation Studio. When you have it installed, there is a new feature. There's basically a special module that comes for free with the core project. So when you have Vegetation Studio installed, you'll have this module that will add a feature here for Vegetation Studio. When you turn that on, there's a button you click in Vegetation Studio, and what it'll actually do is it'll render out a texture of the entire terrain's vegetation. And then what will happen is right as the vegetation starts to fade out, and you're going to get that line, it will blend in the texture, which is an image of what the vegetation looked like on the terrain. So now you'll be able to see your grasses and things all the way off into the distance. And even if you put them on terrain that's dark like this, it will look great because it'll just swap with an image-based representation of it. And as those grasses are usually pretty low, you usually can't really tell the difference, which is a really great feature because that's been one of those things plaguing games forever. And I think we've pretty much solved it. So anyway, that's it for today. I'm sure I missed a bunch of stuff that has been added. Check the docs, watch the threads, talk about it all the time. And a whole bunch of fixes. Parallax mapping now has a start and end fade distance, so you can basically fade off the parallax map to not pay the cost at a distance. And yeah, I think that's it for my notes. So thanks for watching.